to our online listeners. Apparently last week I forgot to turn on the microphone and not realizing that you all don't lip read. So this week it's on, and if I forget again, text or send a message to our website and somebody will get it to me. I apologize. Well, Mike McCarthy was fired last Sunday afternoon after 13 years as head coach of the Green Bay Packers. And since we are all assistant coaches for the team, I suspect we all have explanations for what went wrong. Now, some say that the West Coast offense was outdated and predictable. If we knew what the next play was going to be, well, so did the other team. Now, others say that Aaron Rodgers has gotten a little too big for his very expensive britches. Some say that the atmosphere in the locker room has deteriorated, and others say that the coaches just were not able to bring out the best in the players. Others say that the star players, well, they're just getting way too old and way too injured. And others believe that trading Jordy Nelson, that was the downfall. A lot of people are saying a lot of things. But whatever the reason, it is absolutely clear that the players individually and collectively have not been giving their best to the team this season. And as a result, the win-loss record is, well, it's dismal. And Green Bay is looking for a new head coach. Now, before we are too harsh against the team and some of the players, let's understand there are times when we all decide not to give our best. Sometimes we don't give our best to our jobs, sometimes we don't give our best to our families, sometimes we don't have any time to give anything to our friends, sometimes we don't give the best to the church, sometimes we don't give the best to the team, and a lot of times we don't give our best to God. And we all have reasons for why we do not give our best. Maybe our boss is the problem. Maybe our pay is the problem. Maybe it's our co-workers that make it hard to give our best. Maybe it's our marriage that's getting in the way. Maybe the kids, they're the problem. Maybe we're just too old, too hurt, and too tired to give much of anything to much of anybody. Well, choose a reason, any reason, for those times when all of us just decide we're not going to give our best to anything or anyone. And not giving our best, well, it happens to all of us, and we usually have a lot of reasons why. The prophet Malachi wrote to warn the people of Jerusalem that they had not been giving their best. The Babylonian Empire was defeated by the Persian Empire after 80 years of the people being in captivity. During those 80 years, many of the exiles, as they came to be called, decided, well, it's been a long time. We're in our third generation of family here. Let's just make our homes here in Babylon. Let's build a house. Let's get our families going. Let's get a new life. Let's learn the language. Let's learn the culture. And they just decided to settle in where they were because, frankly, Jerusalem, where they used to live, their old faith, their way of life, that was long forgotten. Even so, a small number of exiles managed to keep the faith and to look forward to the day that God would set them free and send them back home to Jerusalem. The remnant of the faithful, as that small group was called, made it their practice to read and reread all of the writings of their prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. They read and reread God's promises to them. They read and reread and believed in the depths of their hearts that one day God would send a deliverer who would set them free so they could go home to Jerusalem. And when they were there, they would rebuild the temple. They would rebuild the city. They would make Jerusalem great again. And people of all nations would stream to the Temple Hill. And Israel would be that shining light, that nation where everybody knew God lived and God ruled. Well, when Persia did defeat Babylon, King Darius I realized that the best way to settle all of that vast expanse of territory that ran from the Euphrates and Tigris rivers all the way down, up and over, through Babylon, through Syria, all the way down through Jerusalem into the Negev desert. The best way to settle all of that new territory and keep the peace was by sending all of the former prisoners of war that wanted to home. And not only would he send them home, he would give them enough money and enough materials to build anything they wanted to build, to buy the land they wanted to buy, and to settle back in and to think, oh yes, it was King Darius. We love you. Now, the exiles were ready to go. But they discovered that when they went home to Jerusalem, that their high hopes were beginning to be dashed against reality. Because they figured out that the people who now owned the land they used to own, the people who now live in the homes they used to live in, didn't want to give them up. And even though they had money to buy the land and buy the houses, well, the current occupants weren't ready to sell. And so they had to fight to get their land back, and once they got it back, they had to fight to keep it. The remnant of the faithful that came back home were living in poverty and fighting to keep the little bit that they had. And they came to the realization that while God had promised Israel would be a powerful and respected nation, it was not happening. And not only were God's promises not coming true, God wasn't really giving God's very best to them. In fact, they were pretty sure God wasn't even around anymore. And as long as they couldn't trust God, as long as God wasn't giving them God's best, they were no longer going to give their best to God. And it began with the sacrifices the priests were making. The priests had built an altar and were ready to continue the practice of making sacrifices to God morning and evening. And the practice was for the people, the landowners, to bring the best animals they had, the most perfect young bulls, the most perfect young sheep, the most perfect young birds, to be sacrificed on the altar. Unfortunately, people weren't ready to give up their best anymore, because after all, what was God doing for them? And so rather than having the best of everything to offer to God, the priests ended up offering lame, sick, and blind animals to God. God was not getting the best sacrifices from anyone. And not only that, the foreign exiles, the former exiles who came home, decided, well, they came home, they hadn't started families up there, they came home, they were ready to start a family, the only people around, well, were foreigners. So they're going to marry foreign men and women and worship the gods and goddesses of their spouses, their new husbands and wives. And the priests, well, they had gone off the rails. They believed that they were above the laws of God. Turns out no one was giving their best to God or anything else. Now Malachi wrote to tell those former exiles that while they were not giving their best, one day, unannounced, God would appear. And when God appeared, their sinful, less than best behavior would not be tolerated. Instead, God was going to purify the priests and all the people the same way precious metal was purified. In Hebrew scriptures, God appeared as fire and smoke. And when God appeared, God's presence was going to purify those who were giving their less than their best, the same way that fire purified gold and silver. And just for a point of reference, you have to have a fire that's at least 1,832 degrees in order to melt gold and silver. Okay, if God's going to apply that to God's people, you got to know that's going to leave a mark. But Malachi said, shape up, folks, because God's going to appear, so you will once again want to give your best to God. Well, God didn't show up right away. But when God did come to earth to purify God's people, to do what only God could do, God didn't come as fire, and God didn't come as smoke. God came as a newborn baby. We look forward to Christmas as a time when God comes to live with us, to do what only God can do. Jesus came to live with us to set us free from all the reasons we use to give God less than our best. Just think about those newborn babies in our lives. None of us would think about giving them anything less than our best. We want to give babies our best. We want to be good people to them. We want to give them the food they need. We want to give them the love they need. We want to give them our best. And God came to us as a baby. And we ended up wanting to give God our best. God gave us God's best, not to punish us with fire and smoke, but to forgive us for all the times we were certain that God wasn't around. God came to give us our best, his best, not to punish us, but to assure us that we would never be alone. God came to give us God's very best, God's presence as Jesus, our Christ, so that we could be inspired to give God our best in return. Now, we all have reasons for those times when we don't give God our very best. And let's face it, there are some days when even our very best is just not very good. We all have days when our very best stinks. But on those days when we remember what God has given us, we remember that God has already given us the best coach available, the best teacher available, the best rabbi available, the best healer available, the best Messiah available, that Jesus left the glory of heaven to live in first century Israel, not to punish us, but to give us God's very best. So the question for us today is to ponder whether we are giving our best back to God. Am I giving my best time, or am I giving whatever I have to spare? Am I giving my best abilities to God, or am I giving kind of what's left over to God? Am I giving my first money to God, or am I giving God whatever I have left at the end of the month, which most of us know is? See, God gave us God's very best. And when we know that, and when we appreciate that, we can be inspired to give our best back to God. And when we give God our best, it really works. When we give God our best time and our best abilities and our first money, it works. Because we are filled with a hope and a peace and a love and a joy that begins to bubble up out of us. And we can't help but express the joy that comes from giving our best to God. That's our question. God gave us God's best. What are we giving back? Amen.